Okay, continuing our work with factoring polynomials. Now we're going to talk about some special polynomials, and this one that we're going to talk about today, this is a trinomial, and this is the perfect square trinomial. Now we met this trinomial back in another chapter when we were multiplying polynomials, but so let me remind you what these look like. It's a trinomial, so you're going to have three terms, and the first term is a perfect square. So the first term is a square, and the last term is a square. And then the middle term is always double what you would get if you multiplied together the square root of the first and last term. So there will be a double the product. So for example, let me show you an example of this. Let's look at number 1 here. Notice that our first term, 9x squared, is a perfect square, and that our last term is 64 is also a perfect square. And what did we square to get 9x squared? We squared a 3x. So the first term is a square, and it's 3x squared. And then the last term, 64, is 8 squared. So that's also a square. So now let's check our middle term. If this trinomial is a perfect square trinomial, then the middle term will be found by multiplying together the 3x times the 8 and doubling it. So 3x times 8 is 24x, and double that is indeed 48. So that means we do have a perfect square trinomial here in number 1. And what we're going to learn today is that that means that we can factor that as a binomial squared using 3x plus 8. It is a trinomial, so you could factor this trinomial using one of the techniques that you've learned before, the AC method or bottoms-up method or trial and error. But the numbers are kind of big, so if you happen to recognize the pattern, if you see that you have perfect squares in that first and last term, it's always a good idea to check that middle term because it'll save you a lot of time. You know that you can just factor in one step like this. Okay, look at number 2. So again, we have a perfect square as our first term and a perfect square as our last term. In our first term, that's 9y was squared, and in our last term, 4 was squared. So now we're going to check that middle term. So we need to multiply 9y times 4. So 9y times 4 is 36y, and double that is 72y. So we got that right. But did you notice that we have a negative middle term? So what that means is that when you come over here to square your binomial, that your binomial is going to have it's going to be a difference. There's going to be a minus sign in the middle. So 9y minus 4. In number 3, did you notice a GCF? So our first step is going to be to factor out a GCF of 2w. So we're going to factor that out first. That leaves w squared plus 12w plus 36. Okay, and then did you notice a square as our first and your last term? Yep, those are perfect squares in the trinomial. And we squared a w and we squared a 6, right? We squared a w and a 6. When we multiply those together, that's 6w. When we double that, that's 12w. So we have the right middle term. So what does that mean? That means that we can factor this as, and then don't forget your 2w, bring that down, w plus 6 squared. So it saves time if you can recognize these patterns for our perfect square trinomial. This will really save you some factoring time. In number 4, there is a GCF, once again, of 5. There's a 5 GCF. Okay, so we're going to factor that out first. It leaves us 4y squared minus 20y plus 25. We've got perfect squares in our first and third term, and we squared a 2y here in the first term and a 5 in the last, right? 2y times 5 is 10y. Double that is 20y. So we have the right middle term. But we have to keep in mind that we have a subtraction, right? A negative sign in the middle. So there's a minus here. We squared a 2y and we squared a 5. So our factor form is that. Okay, you're starting to get the idea? Okay, we have one more. Okay, we've got, oh, these numbers look big, don't they? So let's see, what's our GCF this time? There's a 2, and it looks like x to the fourth, right? All three terms have an x to the fourth in common. So we're going to factor that out first. So 2x to the fourth, that leaves 16x squared minus 40xy plus 25y squared. So we have two, did you notice we have the two variables, not just x, but we also have a y. Okay, but that's all right. Now, is this a perfect square? Yes. And what about this one, 25y squared? Yes. So we squared, let me write it here, numbers are getting a little big. We squared a 4x here, didn't we? And we squared a 5y there. And when we multiply 4x times 5y, 4x times 5y, that gives us 20xy. And when we double that, we get 40xy, which is what we have here, isn't it? We have a negative 40xy, so that matches this. So we're good. This is excellent. So that means we can factor this. So our 2x to the fourth, don't forget your GCF. And now in the binomial is going to be 4x minus 5y squared. And don't forget the y in that last term. Sometimes students forget that. They get all excited to factor and then they forget that the y in the end. I hope this helps.